Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly into the darker corners of the Middle Ages, where the nights were long, the streets smelled like regret, and justice was, well, a bit inconsistent. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, and let your mind drift to a time when being a criminal could mean anything from stealing a loaf of bread to owning too many cats, because the medieval world had its own sense of logic and its own rogues, murderers, and masterminds who, somehow, became legends. Some were just desperate. Some were disturbingly clever. And a few were so wildly awful that you almost have to respect their commitment to chaos. Let's begin with a man whose name sounds more like a bedtime story villain than an actual human, Ezzelino da Romano. He ruled parts of northern Italy in the 13th century and had all the subtlety of a warhammer. Chroniclers described him as cruel, paranoid, and disturbingly fond of creative torture. His hobby list included burning cities and executing relatives, because why not double down on the family drama? He was called the son of the devil, and not metaphorically. People genuinely believed his mother conceived him through infernal means. Medieval rumor mills were undefeated. At one point, Ezzelino took 11,000 citizens hostage from Padua, locked them up, and let them starve. When asked about it, he apparently shrugged, classic medieval leadership energy. But not all villains were noblemen with castles. Some were peasants with knives and way too much free time. Like Fra Dolcino, who started as a preacher and ended as one of medieval Italy's most wanted men. He told his followers that property was evil and the church was corrupt, not a popular opinion in 1300. His rebellion spiraled into full-blown chaos, banditry, and cannibalism. After years on the run, he was caught and executed in the most medieval way possible: public torture and fire. Let's float northward for a moment to France, where Gilles de Rais took fallen noblemen to a whole new level. He was a rich, educated knight who once fought alongside Joan of Arc. Heroic, right? Until he retired and decided to spend his fortune on alchemy, demons, and unspeakable crimes. Guile became one of history's first recorded serial killers. His victims were mostly children, and yet his contemporaries thought he was just eccentric for years. His trial reads like a horror novel, but his downfall came not from guilt, but from debt. Turns out, he literally couldn't afford evil anymore. Still awake. Good, because the medieval world had a lot of criminals who thought they were philosophers, prophets, or just very misunderstood businessmen. Bandits roamed highways, pirates haunted the English Channel, and thieves operated in cities where law enforcement meant hope someone's watching. We'll drift next into England, where outlaws weren't just common, they were practically celebrities. And one of them, of course, became a legend who still gets movie deals every decade. Let's float over now to the real Robin Hood and the darker world of medieval banditry. So, picture England in the late Middle Ages: muddy roads, shady taverns, and a justice system that mostly relied on whoever had the loudest voice. Outlaws weren't rare. They were practically a profession. And in this setting, we meet the myth that refused to die: Robin Hood. Now, before you imagine green tights and merry archery contests, let's lower expectations. The real Robin Hood, if he existed at all, was likely less of a charming rebel and more of a rural gang leader with decent PR. Medieval England had hundreds of Robin Hoods recorded in court documents. Turns out, Robin Hood became a kind of placeholder name, like John Doe, but for outlaws. These were men driven to the forests after being declared outlawed, meaning they lost all legal protection. You could kill them on sight. Their property, gone. Their reputation, non-existent. So, living in the woods with a few like-minded criminals suddenly looked like the better option. Early ballads about Robin Hood show a man who robbed the rich. Yes, but not necessarily to help the poor. Mostly, he robbed corrupt churchmen, royal officials, and travelers who looked too smug. He was rude, proud, and occasionally generous, sort of a medieval anti-hero prototype. It's not hard to see why the peasants adored the idea, in a time when taxes were brutal and kings weren't known for empathy. Imagining a rogue who outsmarted them all was oddly comforting. But the real roads of medieval England weren't full of noble thieves. They were crawling with gangs, literal organized bands of robbers who made a living raiding travelers and villages. The Cotero gang in the 1320s was one of the more famous ones, active in the English Midlands. They were led by the Cotero brothers, a family who decided that murder, extortion, and bribing officials was more lucrative than farming. And the best part, sometimes local lords quietly supported them. Why? Because they provided off-the-books muscle. A bit of violence here, a little intimidation there, and suddenly your rivals stopped causing trouble. It's all very medieval mafia. Even priests weren't always innocent. There are records of clerical gangs, groups of young clergy who went bandit mode between religious duties. The lines between sinner and saint were, let's say, flexible. Punishment for outlaws was predictably harsh. If caught, you might be hanged, mutilated, or displayed as a warning. But the truth, most were never caught. England's forests were vast, and the sheriffs, unlike the ones in the movies, didn't exactly have the manpower or enthusiasm for long forest chases. The whole system of outlawry was a loophole-riddled mess. Some were falsely accused, others deliberately broke the law to avoid debts. A few even chose outlaw life because it offered more freedom than being a servant or peasant. Imagine thinking, you know what sounds better than farming? Being legally killable. That's how grim normal life was. Still, among these muddy trails and outlaw hideouts, a few names rose above rumor into legend. Robin Hood became folklore, but others became cautionary tales, proof that rebellion, however romantic, didn't end well for most. Let's float now from the shady English woods to the grimy streets of France, where medieval crime went from rustic to sophisticated, because in Paris, crime wasn't about hiding in forests, it was about blending in, and the next man we meet might just be the most successful thief of his century. Now, we drift gently into medieval France, a place of cathedrals, court intrigue, and crime that was, well, more elegant than English mud-based outlawry here. We meet a man named Francois Villon, poet, scholar, thief, and, depending on who you asked, a total menace. Villon was born in Paris around 1431, the same year Joan of Arc was burned. So, already, the vibes were dramatic. He studied at the University of Paris and became a Master of Arts, which sounds impressive, until you realize it mostly qualified you to argue about theology or starve politely. He chose a third option, crime. Villon started small. He got into tavern fights, stole things, ran with bad company, classic stuff. But his talent for words, sharp, funny, self-aware, meant he wrote poetry about it all. He turned his life of petty theft and regret into some of the most human, relatable verse of the Middle Ages. Imagine if Shakespeare dropped out of school and started a gang that robbed monks. That's Villon. His first big heist happened in 1456, when he and his friends robbed the Collège de Navarre, stealing around 500 gold crowns, a small fortune. It was an inside job, of course. And when the law caught on, Villon vanished from Paris for years. He wandered France, drinking, writing, stealing, and occasionally ending up in jail. His poems are full of guilt and wit, mocking society while confessing his own sins. He wrote about hunger, hypocrisy, love, and execution, all in the same exhausted, self-aware tone. He knew he was wasting his talent, but also that the world didn't reward poets any better than thieves. Eventually, he returned to Paris and, of course, got arrested again. This time, for a brawl that left a priest dead. He escaped hanging, was banished, came back again, and got caught again. Villon's final known conviction was for robbery, and he was sentenced to death in 1462. But he somehow charmed the courts one last time. The sentence was commuted to 10 years of exile. After that, he disappeared. No one knows how or where he died. One of history's most talented poets, just banished into the fog. And yet Villon's voice survived. His writing drips with dark humor and weary honesty, the same kind that makes us like him centuries later. He was a criminal, yes, but also painfully aware of what that meant. He once wrote, "I know all things, yet know myself not." which feels oddly modern for a guy who probably spent half his life sleeping in taverns. Still, Villon wasn't France's only literary criminal. Medieval Europe was full of people who blurred the lines between intellect and mischief. But across the continent, another kind of criminal thrived, one not driven by hunger or rebellion, but by something colder. In 15th century France, that darkness took the form of Guy de Race, once a noble, later one of the most horrifying figures of medieval history. A knight, a hero of the 100 Years' War, and a companion of Joan of Arc, until he decided that good deeds were overrated. Let's drift toward his story, slow and careful, because Guy de Race wasn't your average villain. He was what happens when medieval power, paranoia, and privilege rot together in one soul. Guy de Race, the name itself sounds noble, doesn't it? A French knight from a powerful family, born around 1405, raised among castles, clergy, and far too much money. He was everything a medieval aristocrat was supposed to be: handsome, educated, devout, and just the right amount of dramatic. He fought bravely beside Joan of Arc, earning fame, titles, and lands for his service. Chroniclers described him as fearless, almost theatrical, on the battlefield. He loved grandeur, ceremony, gold-embroidered armor, and long sermons about destiny. Basically, imagine a knight who took both fashion and faith way too seriously. But once the war ended, Guy de Race discovered something most medieval nobles did. Peace was boring. There were no battles left to fight, no enemies to impress, and his inherited fortune began to shrink. And rather than manage his estates like a responsible lord, he poured everything into bizarre projects, theatrical pageants, alchemy, and what he called spiritual experiments. Always a great sign when a rich man starts using that phrase. He built chapels, funded choirs, commissioned enormous performances in which he sometimes starred. And when that wasn't enough, he turned to darker curiosities. He became obsessed with finding the Philosopher's Stone, the mythical substance that could turn metal into gold. His wealth was vanishing, and he wanted to cheat both nature and bankruptcy. This is where things went from eccentric to monstrous. Historical records, and later confessions, suggest that Guile began experimenting not just with metals, but with life itself. His rituals involved summoning demons, performing sacrifices, and, horrifyingly, the murder of children. Now, let's stay calm here. This isn't a horror story, just a tragic descent into what unchecked privilege can become. Guile used his status to hide his crimes for years. People whispered about the strange disappearances near his estates, but no one dared accuse a noble who once fought beside Joan of Arc. Eventually, though, the whispers became too loud. The church investigated. In 1440, Guile was arrested, tried, and confessed to everything. Whether his confession was voluntary or extracted under pressure is still debated, but the scale of what he admitted stunned the court. He was executed that same year, hanged and burned, a fallen knight whose name would later inspire literary legends. Centuries later, his story was loosely connected to the French folktale Bluebeard, the nobleman who murdered his wives. It's almost poetic in a grim way. Guy de Race started as a hero in shining armor and ended as one of medieval Europe's darkest cautionary tales. His fall wasn't about greed or politics. It was about a mind collapsing under its own vanity. And perhaps the most chilling part, people in his time saw him as more tragic than evil. They pitied him, as if genius and madness were just two sides of the same gilded coin. But Gilles wasn't alone in his brand of terrible fascination. Medieval Europe had a type: wealthy men with too much time, too little conscience, and an unhealthy obsession with power. So, let's float across the sea now, to Scotland, where one family turned murder into a full-time business. Their story would later become legend, whispered in ballads and old taverns. The tale of Sawney Bean and the cannibal clan that supposedly terrorized travelers in medieval Scotland. Now, Sawney Bean, whether he truly existed or not, became one of the most enduring figures in Scotland's dark folklore. His story reads like something between a nightmare and a bureaucratic complaint about poor road safety. According to legend, Sawney Bean was born in East Lothian, sometime in the late 14th or early 15th century. He wasn't rich, or noble, or particularly motivated to work, which, to be fair, was a pretty common medieval mood. He allegedly left home with his wife, a woman just as unscrupulous as he was, and the two decided that the best way to make a living wasn't farming or trading, but murdering travelers and eating them. Romantic, right? The Beans settled in a coastal cave near Benane Head, a spot that could only be reached during low tide. There, according to centuries of retellings, they built an entire family, not metaphorically, but literally. Dozens of children, grandchildren, and inbred descendants, all born into a world where robbery and cannibalism were the family business. They'd attack people traveling the lonely roads between towns, drag their victims back to the cave, butcher them like livestock, and pickle or dry the remains for later meals. Efficient, if nothing else. Now, it's important to pause here and note that no official record from the time confirms Sawney Bean ever existed. Historians suspect it's more of a folk invention, possibly based on earlier tales meant to warn people against traveling alone, or to remind them that rural Scotland could be terrifying if you strayed off the path. Still, the story stuck, partly because it hit all the right medieval horror buttons: isolation, hunger, corruption of the family unit, and fear of the unknown. It was also deeply moralistic, and if you live like a beast, you'll die like one kind of parable. The legend ends with one unlucky traveler escaping and alerting King James. The king allegedly led an armed search party that stormed the cave, discovered piles of bones, and executed the entire Bean clan without trial. The men were dismembered, the women burned alive, an ending so dramatic it feels almost like a stage play, whether you believe it or not. The Sawney Bean myth became one of the most retold true crime stories of the medieval imagination, and it says something about the time period, how people processed horror through legend, and how crime became cautionary folklore long before printed newspapers or court transcripts. But even if the Beans were fictional, real criminals of the era could be just as disturbing and just as creative. Take, for example, the wandering killers known as bandits of the roads. Small armies of desperate men who thrived in the chaos of post-plague Europe. Many were former soldiers, trained, unemployed, and very bored, turning highways into their personal hunting grounds. Medieval kings complained constantly about brigands robbing merchants, pilgrims, and tax collectors. Some even operated with unofficial royal tolerance, as long as they didn't steal too much from the wrong people. Because really, what was the medieval justice system? A few sheriffs, some watchmen, and divine punishment if you lived long enough to regret anything. Still, there was one criminal who stood out, not for his violence, but for his theatrics. His name was Eustace the monk, and he might just be one of the strangest men to ever terrorize medieval Europe. A nobleman's son, a monk by training, a pirate by choice, and a prankster by nature. Let's drift toward northern France now, where Eustace began his life in a monastery, but quickly discovered he preferred the open seas to silent prayer. His story, half fact, half chaos, shows that sometimes the line between criminal and folk hero was very, very thin. Eustace the monk was born around 1170 in Boulogne, northern France, which was, at the time, the perfect place to grow up if you wanted to spend your adult life getting into sword fights and starting political feuds. He supposedly studied black magic in Toledo, because of course he did, before joining a monastery. But, as you might imagine, he wasn't exactly the vow of silence type. Monastic life got dull fast, so Eustace decided to quit, or, more accurately, got himself expelled for bad behavior. No one knows exactly what that meant, but given his later career, let's assume it involved at least one brawl, and possibly a missing barrel of wine. After his monk phase ended, he returned home and entered the service of the Count of Boulogne. For a while, things went well. He had money, status, and probably better food than he'd ever eaten in the monastery. But when a feud broke out between his family and another noble, Eustace took it way too personally. He burned down property, robbed caravans, and according to chroniclers, launched a one-man campaign of chaos across northern France. Eventually, he was outlawed, which in medieval terms meant you're now legally fair game for everyone. So, logically, Eustace became a pirate. He fled across the English Channel, teamed up with King John of England, and began raiding French coasts on behalf of the English crown. But Eustace was an opportunist. Loyalty wasn't really his thing. When John betrayed him, Eustace switched sides again and started attacking English ships instead. At one point, he even used disguises to sneak into enemy ports, pretending to be a humble merchant before turning pirate at night. Chroniclers loved that detail. They described him as a master of deception, a trickster of the sea. He had bases scattered across the Channel Islands and even held a small fleet under his command. For a time, he was one of the most feared men on the water. Not because he was particularly ruthless, though he was, but because he was unpredictable. One week he was fighting for England, the next for France, and the week after that, probably just for himself. By 1217, Eustace's luck ran out. He was captured during a naval battle off Sandwich, yes, Sandwich, as in the English port, and promptly executed. His head was displayed as a warning to anyone else thinking of freelancing between kings. But even in death, Eustace earned a weird kind of fame. Chroniclers wrote about him like a cross between a villain and a legend, a medieval Jack Sparrow without the eyeliner, and a reminder that, back then, piracy was just another form of unemployment insurance. Still, compared to some other medieval criminals, Eustace was practically charming. He robbed kings and burned ships, sure, but he wasn't skinning people alive or boiling anyone in oil. For that level of creativity, we'll need to float east to the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, where one nobleman took sadism to a level that even the Middle Ages found a bit much. His name was Gila de Reis, and while history mostly remembers him as a monster, he started out as something far stranger, a national hero. Before his fall, he was one of France's richest nobles, a celebrated knight, and even a companion of Joan of Arc. But beneath the banners and gold and military glory, Guile carried a darkness that would eventually make him one of the most infamous figures of his century. Let's settle in for this one, because his story is where chivalry, power, and madness all meet in the most unsettling way imaginable. So, Gila de Reis, if his name sounds vaguely poetic, that's because he was born into one of France's oldest noble families, the kind who could trace their bloodline back to people who were already annoying peasants during the early Crusades. He was rich, well-educated, and charming, basically medieval France's idea of an He inherited vast lands in Brittany, Anjou, and Poitou, and by the time he was in his 20s, he was so wealthy that even the king owed him money. And that was saying something, because kings were practically professional debt collectors in those days. Now, in the 1420s, France was in chaos. The 100 Years' War was still raging, and along came a teenage peasant girl named Joan of Arc, who claimed she'd been sent by God to save the kingdom. Most nobles laughed. Gilles, on the other hand, joined her. Maybe he believed her visions, or maybe he just thought she'd make a great headline. Either way, he rode beside her into battle, helping her lift the siege of Orleans and escort Charles VII to his coronation. He was decorated, knighted, and showered with titles. For a brief, shining moment, Gilles was the poster boy of medieval patriotism, brave, loyal, and fabulously dressed. Because yes, he loved fashion. He wore gold-threaded robes, jeweled armor, and enough perfume to gas a banquet hall. He threw lavish feasts that made other nobles look like they were eating soup out of helmets. Chroniclers said he staged elaborate theatrical performances, entire plays that cost the same as a small castle to produce. But behind all that glitter, something dark was brewing. After Joan's capture and execution, Guile seemed to unravel. He withdrew from politics, retreated to his estates, and started spending money like a man trying to buy his way out of despair. He burned through his fortune on alchemy, black magic, and disturbing experiments to summon demons. It wasn't long before rumors began circulating, whispers that children were disappearing near his castles. At first, no one dared accuse him directly. He was too powerful, too noble. But by the late 1430s, the evidence had piled up. When investigators finally descended on his estate, what they found was horrifying, even by medieval standards. Testimonies described ritual killings, sadistic acts, and twisted ceremonies conducted in the name of Satan. Gila was accused of murdering dozens, perhaps hundreds, of children over several years. And here's the thing, he confessed. Not after torture, not after long imprisonment. He just broke down and admitted it all. He wept, begged for forgiveness, and claimed he'd been led astray by pride and despair. In 1440, he was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. The once golden knight, the hero of France, was hanged and burned before a crowd of thousands. His fall from grace was so shocking that it haunted French folklore for centuries. Some even believe Gil inspired the fairy tale Bluebeard, the nobleman who kills his wives and hides their bodies in a locked room. But the question still lingers. Was Gil truly guilty of everything he confessed to, or was some of it medieval exaggeration? After all, this was a world where people still thought alchemists could turn lead into gold. Still, whether monster or victim of his own madness, Gila de Race represents a pattern that medieval history never quite escapes: power, corruption, and an imagination that should have stayed inside a nightmare. And speaking of nightmare figures, let's drift south for a moment, to Italy. Because while France was busy producing tragic knights and pirate monks, Italy was cooking up its own breed of master criminals. The kind who didn't just steal gold. They stole trust. The kind of men who could walk into a palace with nothing but charm and leave with the deed to the palace itself. Yes, we're talking about the con artists, poisoners, and scheming nobles who made Renaissance Italy a playground for crime, corruption, and creative murder. Now, Italy in the late Middle Ages was basically Europe's drama capital. A patchwork of city-states where everyone was either at war, getting married for power, or plotting to poison someone before dinner. Florence had bankers, Venice had spies, and Rome had, well, popes with questionable hobbies. Among this chaos, crime wasn't just a profession, it was an art form, and no one embodied that better than the Borgia family. You've probably heard the name. It's one of those infamous dynasties that sounds like it should come with a warning label. The Borgias were Spanish by blood, but Italian by ambition, and by the 15th century, they had climbed their way into the heart of Vatican politics through charm, corruption, and a generous amount of bribery. The head of the family, Rodrigo Borgia, eventually became Pope Alexander VI. That's right, one of history's most scandalous men ended up as head of the Catholic Church, because of course he did. Rodrigo's papacy was, let's just say, lively. He openly acknowledged his mistress, Vanessa de Catane, and fathered several children, including the two who would go on to make the Borgia name legendary: Cesare and Lucretia. Now, Cesare Borgia might be the closest thing medieval Europe ever got to a Bond villain. He was brilliant, ruthless, and spectacularly ambitious. Appointed a cardinal in his teens, because nepotism was the family brand, he later ditched the church to pursue his true passion, conquering Italy. He led armies, executed rivals, and ruled territories with icy precision. Niccolò Machiavelli, who actually met Cesare, was so impressed that he used him as the model for the prince. Imagine being so cold-blooded that you become the handbook for tyranny. Meanwhile, his sister Lucretia Borgia got dragged through centuries of gossip. She was accused of incest, murder, and every possible scandal you could fit between confession and mass. Modern historians think a lot of that was propaganda, but the rumors were so good that no one cared. According to legend, the Borgias hosted elaborate banquets where enemies were served poisoned wine, and secret trapdoors in the Vatican led to underground tunnels for disposing of bodies. Did all of that really happen? Probably not. Did people believe it? Absolutely. Because in the medieval mind, the Borgias were the ultimate villains, rich, powerful, and untouchable. They didn't just break rules, they rewrote them. Rodrigo, the Pope, used his position to sell church offices like concert tickets. Cesare wiped out noble families who stood in his way. And Lucretia, well, she managed to marry 3 powerful men, each more politically useful than the last. By the time she was done, she was one of the most influential women in Italy. What makes them fascinating is how normal their corruption was for the time. Everyone poisoned, plotted, and schemed. The Borgias were just better at it. They turned political murder into performance art. And yet, for all their infamy. They were also products of a system that rewarded exactly that kind of behavior. When the church was both the government and the bank, morality was flexible. Forgiveness could be bought, power could be inherited, and sin was just another form of strategy. It's almost poetic. The family that preached salvation also made sin look so organized. But let's drift away from Vatican halls and velvet robes for a bit. Let's walk down a darker alley, the kind that smells of wet stone, candle smoke, and quiet desperation. Because not all medieval criminals were nobles. Some were just too good at surviving. Next, we'll meet the outlaws, assassins, and highway robbers who turned the muddy roads of medieval Europe into hunting grounds. People who weren't born into power, but learned how to steal it. All right, picture this. You're traveling along a lonely medieval road somewhere between London and York. It's dark, your horse is tired, and the only sound is the wind rustling through the trees. Then, out of nowhere, someone steps onto the path, cloaked, silent, holding a blade that glints in the moonlight. Congratulations, you've just met a highwayman. Now, before the age of romanticized outlaws came along, Robin Hood became the forest's most misunderstood social worker. Real, medieval highway robbers were much less noble and far more terrifying. These were desperate men who survived by stealing from travelers, merchants, and anyone unfortunate enough to be on the road after sunset. You might think medieval towns were dangerous, but roads were worse. There were no police, no emergency signals, and definitely no help button. Just forests, shadows, and the occasional distant monastery bell. Take Eustace the monk, for instance. Yes, a monk, at least originally. He started life as a Benedictine monk in France, but after a family feud went wrong, he abandoned the monastery, became a pirate, and then a mercenary. Because why settle for prayer when you can plunder? Eustace was clever, ruthless, and weirdly theatrical. He disguised himself as a woman, a peasant, even a leper, to escape capture. At one point, he terrorized the English Channel, raiding ships under both French and English flags, depending on which side paid better that week. Eventually, his luck ran out in 1217 when his ship was captured by the English fleet. They offered him a choice: surrender and maybe live, or resist and definitely die. Eustace, being Eustace, demanded payment for his own surrender. They responded by cutting off his head. Negotiation failed, but he wasn't alone in this morally flexible career path. Across Europe, other highway robbers were turning chaos into cash. In Germany, the forests were crawling with Ritter, or robber knights, minor nobles who lost their fortunes and decided, logically, that the next best career move was extortion. These knights would build small castles along trade routes and charge tolls to merchants. If you didn't pay, you'd be relieved of your cargo and possibly your head. One of the most infamous, Eppelin von Galenian, became a kind of folk antihero. When cornered by authorities, he supposedly leaped his horse off the walls of Nuremberg Castle into the moat below and escaped. That story is probably exaggerated, but it's been painted, sung about, and mythologized ever since. The strange part is how blurred the line was between noble and criminal. A knight could raid a caravan and call it tax collection. A priest could take bribes and call it absolution. The medieval world didn't have modern distinctions. Morality often depended on who was writing the records. Even in England, law enforcement was basically crowdsourced. Local sheriffs relied on unpaid watchmen, and punishment was often public and brutal hangings, mutilations, or being displayed in cages. Yet, despite all that, highway robbery remained weirdly common. Because in an age of famine, plague, and political corruption, stealing wasn't just a crime, it was sometimes a career path. And the poor, they often admired these criminals. After all, most nobles were thieves in fancier clothing. The difference was that the outlaws didn't pretend otherwise. That's why figures like Robin Hood, fictional or not, resonated so deeply. He was the fantasy of a thief with morals, a man who broke laws but upheld justice. Whether or not he existed, his legend grew because it reflected what people wished the world could be. Unfair, yes, but not entirely heartless. Of course, not every criminal got a ballad written about them. Some vanished into the woods, their names lost to time. Others met the rope, swinging over the marketplace as a warning to everyone else. But the truth is, medieval Europe needed its criminals. They were a mirror of the system itself, chaotic, unjust, and painfully human. So let's move on from the muddy roads and crumbling castles and drift toward the glittering courts again, because some of the most devious crimes weren't committed by thieves or pirates, but by kings and queens with crowns heavy enough to crush their own sense of guilt. Let's meet a few of them next. So, we've covered the Monkstern pirates, the highwaymen, and the knights who treated robbery like a family business. But now let's step back into the royal courts, where the crimes were quieter, cleaner, and somehow far more disturbing. Because in the Middle Ages, crime wasn't just something that happened in the shadows. It happened in palaces, behind silken curtains, over jeweled goblets, and whispered prayers. And when kings sinned, they did it with flair. Let's start with King John of England, the one from all those Robin Hood stories. He ruled from 1199 to 1216, and to put it mildly, nobody liked him. His subjects, his nobles, his own family, all united by one shared thought: this guy is the worst. John wasn't just cruel. He was also incompetent in a strangely creative way. He taxed everything that moved, then lost half his kingdom in France through pure negligence. He imprisoned nobles, confiscated property, and probably starved more people in dungeons than rats in medieval kitchens. But his most infamous crime, murdering his own nephew, Arthur of Brittany. Arthur had a stronger claim to the throne, which obviously made him an inconvenience. So John had him captured in 1203, and well, Arthur mysteriously vanished soon after. Chroniclers say John personally killed him with his bare hands during a drunken rage, then threw the body into the River Seine. Others claim he ordered the deed done in secret. Either way, Arthur was never seen again. It's one thing to be a tyrant. It's another to be that obvious about it. And yet, John managed to hang on to power, barely, until his barons got fed up and forced him to sign the Magna Carta. Ironically, a man who violated every law ended up creating the document that became the foundation of English liberty. History has a sense of humor like that. Now, while John was busy alienating everyone in England, another royal across the channel was creating chaos of her own. Enter Isabella of France, also known as the She-Wolf of France. She married Edward II of England, which was doomed from the start. Edward was famously devoted not to her, but to his male favorites, particularly one named Piers Gaveston. Gaveston had a knack for mocking nobles, flaunting jewels, and generally behaving like a reality TV villain, centuries ahead of his time. Isabella, understandably, wasn't thrilled. When Edward refused to dismiss Gaveston, civil war broke out. Gaveston was captured and executed by angry barons, but the damage was done. Isabella and Edward's marriage crumbled faster than a stale meat pie. Eventually, Isabella fled to France, met a charming knight named Roger Mortimer, and because she was nothing if not ambitious, returned to England with an army. Together, they overthrew Edward II, imprisoned him, and placed her teenage son on the throne as Edward III. What happened to Edward II after that? Officially, he died in captivity. Unofficially, legends claimed he was murdered in one of the most gruesome ways imaginable, though historians now think that story was propaganda. Still, it tells you everything about how medieval politics worked. If you can't outvote your husband, outcoup him. Isabella ruled as regent for a few years with Mortimer until her son came of age. Then, in classic poetic justice, Edward III turned around and had Mortimer executed, while Isabella was forced into quiet retirement. So, yes, in medieval courts, betrayal was basically a family tradition. And Isabella wasn't even the most treacherous royal around. That honor might go to Richard III, the infamous English king accused of murdering his two young nephews, the princes in the Tower. Richard claimed he was just protecting them, but somehow both boys vanished after he took the crown. He ruled for only 2 years before being defeated and killed in battle by Henry Tudor. Centuries later, When his skeleton was found under a parking lot, historians couldn't help but smile at the irony. From royal poisonings to mysterious disappearances, it's hard to tell where power ended and crime began. These weren't mere villains. They were symbols of what absolute authority could do when left unchecked. So, as the peasants were being hanged for stealing bread, their kings were quietly rewriting history to excuse their own murders. And that's the paradox of medieval justice. It punished the powerless, but worshipped the wicked. Let's drift now into the darker corners of that same society, where law and superstition blurred. And entire towns could turn into mobs, because sometimes the most terrifying criminals of all were the ones holding the torches. So, we've spent a good while among royal poisoners, political assassins, and professional thieves. But the Middle Ages had another kind of criminal. The sort who didn't steal gold or kill kings, but something much stranger: peace of mind. Let's talk about witches, heretics, and the people who hunted them, often with more enthusiasm than logic. Now, contrary to popular belief, the great witch hunts didn't reach their fever pitch until the early modern period, a little after the medieval era. But the groundwork, that was definitely medieval. And it started with fear of disease, famine, misfortune, and, of course, women who knew too much about herbs. In small villages, misfortune needed a reason. Your cow died. A curse. Your bread didn't rise. Witchcraft. Your husband fell ill after drinking too much ale. Clearly, an old widow next door hexed him. It was simple, comforting logic. Blame someone. And preferably someone powerless. The church didn't help much either. By the 13th century, inquisitions were already springing up, supposedly to root out heresy, but often just finding creative ways to punish anyone who didn't fit neatly into the system. One of the earliest manuals for identifying witches, Canon Episcopi, appeared around the 10th century and described witchcraft as mostly delusion, a trick of the devil. But give it a few hundred years, and delusion had turned into capital crime. By the late Middle Ages, whispers of sorcery could send entire towns into panic. And let's not forget the inquisitors. They were like the medieval version of auditors, except instead of spreadsheets, they brought torture devices. Their job was to root out heresy, which, in a society obsessed with faith, could mean almost anything. Maybe you questioned a priest. Maybe you read something that wasn't approved. Maybe you just had a bad haircut. The logic was flawless. If you confessed, you were guilty. If you didn't confess, you were definitely guilty, because who but a heretic could resist truth? But here's the twist. The Inquisition wasn't only about religion. It was also about control, over thought, over fear, over who got to define truth. And like all systems built on paranoia, it started to devour itself. Take the case of Joan of Arc. She was barely a teenager when she claimed to hear voices from God, telling her to lead France to victory during the 100 Years' War, which she actually did quite successfully. But the English, naturally, were not impressed by her divine Wi-Fi connection. Captured, tried by church officials, and accused of heresy. Joan's crimes included wearing men's clothing and claiming divine guidance. Her trial was a masterpiece of hypocrisy. When asked if she heard voices, she said yes. When asked whose voices, she said saints. When asked if she was sure, they accused her of pride. It was the medieval equivalent of a no-win scenario. She was burned at the stake in 1431, her ashes tossed into the Seine, and about 25 years later, the church quietly admitted she might have been innocent after all. Classic medieval bureaucracy. But not all witchcraft accusations ended in fire. Some ended in superstition, paranoia, or just absurdity. In 1324, a wealthy Irish noblewoman named Alice Keitler was accused of sorcery, apparently for having outlived several rich husbands. People claimed she consorted with demons, sacrificed animals, and made potions using the intestines of cocks. Her servant was tortured and executed. But Alice herself managed to escape, possibly to England, where she lived out her days in peace, presumably avoiding poultry. And then there were the animal trials. Yes, you heard that right. Animals put on trial for crimes. A pig that killed a child could be hanged. Locusts could be excommunicated. Even rats were summoned to court and expected to appear, though, shockingly, they often didn't show up. It's the kind of surreal logic only medieval Europe could invent. Justice, so devoted to procedure. It didn't matter if the defendant had hooves, but beneath all that absurdity was something human. Fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of misfortune. Fear that maybe the world didn't make sense. When things went wrong, people reached for stories that did. And that's the recurring theme of medieval crime. Stories. Whether it was outlaws who became legends, monarchs who rewrote history, or inquisitors who saved souls through torment, everyone was spinning a narrative. It wasn't about truth. It was about control. About deciding who got to be a saint, a sinner, or a scapegoat. So, as you lie here drifting off, think about that. The medieval world wasn't just dark or cruel. It was imaginative in all the worst and weirdest ways. And before we end this journey through the crime-riddled night of the Middle Ages, let's drift into one final layer. The quiet kind of crime, the moral corruption, the petty greed and hypocrisy that oiled the whole machine. The ones no one sang songs about, but everyone lived through. So, here we are. The candles burned low, the medieval streets have gone quiet, and our long walk through the darker corners of the Middle Ages is nearly done. We've met thieves, poisoners, heretics, outlaws, and kings who could have used a good therapist. But in the end, medieval crime wasn't really about evil. It was about survival, and occasionally, stupidity dressed up as destiny. Because when you strip away the armor and the superstition, most of it comes down to the same old human mess. People wanting more than they had, more power, more gold, more control, or just one more meal before winter. Some crimes were desperate, some cruel, and some, let's be honest, weirdly bureaucratic. Picture it, a 14th century clerk sitting by candlelight, carefully documenting that a goat stood trial for public indecency. Somewhere, a monk quietly pocketing church donations to buy imported wine. A baron forging land deeds so he can claim a forest he's never seen. And then, of course, your neighborhood executioner, doing what passes for justice while everyone looks on and calls it order. The real heartbeat of medieval crime wasn't always in the gallows or the dungeons. It was in the quiet corners, in whispered deals and small betrayals. The baker who shaved a bit of flour from every sack. The scribe who changed a single line in a will. The noble who bribed a judge. The servant who vanished with the family silver. Tiny fractures in a world that pretended to be holy. And then there was the church, the biggest power player of them all. For an institution devoted to purity, it certainly had a habit of dipping into sin. Simony, indulgences, secret affairs, political meddling. It was less a house of God, and more a multinational corporation with incense. Popes went to war, bishops plotted like bankers, and confession was less about repentance and more about keeping your enemies guessing. But even in that hypocrisy, there was something oddly human. The medieval world wasn't divided neatly into saints and sinners. It was one long gray smear of compromise, fear, and hope. People wanted to believe in justice, even as they broke it. And that's what makes it oddly relatable, because we're still not so different. We've just swapped swords for screens, dungeons for debt, and royal corruption for corporate scandals. But deep down, the machinery's the same. Even the punishments tell a story. Stocks, gallows, exile, branding, all designed to remind everyone else what happened when you strayed. Yet, despite it all, crime never disappeared. It adapted because wherever there are rules, there are people figuring out how to bend them. So, as you lie there, eyes half closed, drifting between then and now, think about how strange and cyclical it all is. We like to imagine we've evolved past the madness of medieval justice. But really, we just gave it better lighting and nicer fonts. Those long-ago criminals, the outlaws, the poisoners, the schemers, they weren't creatures of darkness. They were people navigating a brutal world the only way they knew how. Sometimes through violence, sometimes through cunning, sometimes through sheer bad luck. And maybe, in their own twisted way, they kept the world turning. Because without crime, you can't have law. Without chaos, no order. Without the stories of what went wrong, no one would ever bother to define what right is. So tonight, as the torches of the past flicker out, let's leave the medieval world to its uneasy rest. The thieves have fled, the judges have gone home, and the gallows creak in the wind like old ghosts remembering their work. The cobblestones are wet with rain, the markets are silent, and somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls the midnight hour, not for the dead, but for the living who can't quite sleep. Because that's the thing about history, it never really ends. It just lies there beneath the soil, waiting for us to dig it up again, one strange story at a time. So, close your eyes now, let the echoes fade. The trials are over, the prisons are empty, the torches have gone out, and in the soft hush that follows, the Middle Ages finally drift back into silence, leaving behind nothing but whispers, footprints, and the faint, eternal hum of human imperfection. Good night, traveler. Sleep well. The criminals of history have finally gone quiet.